Korean War nuclear threat. The Korean War nuclear threat was the moment America almost turned the Korean peninsula into radioactive glass because one general couldn't handle losing. In 1950, President Harry Truman watched as North Korean forces pushed his troops into the sea, and his response was to quietly send 10 B-29 bombers loaded with unarmed atomic bombs to Guam just in case things got worse. General Douglas MacArthur, the man who thought he was God's gift to warfare, formally requested authorization to use nuclear weapons on December 9, 1950, and when Truman said no, MacArthur submitted a shopping list of Chinese targets and the exact number of atomic bombs he'd need to vaporize them. The impact was terrifying because MacArthur wanted field commanders' discretion, meaning he could drop nukes whenever he felt like it, without asking permission, which would have dragged the Soviet Union into the war and turned Korea into the opening act of World War III. By the time the armistice was signed in 1953, B-29s had flown 21,000 sorties and dropped 167,000 tons of conventional bombs, leaving North Korea without electricity. But the fact that we came this close to nuclear war because one general had an ego problem should keep you awake at night. Berlin Crisis. Berlin Crisis was a 3-day staring contest between American and Soviet tanks that nearly ended with mushroom clouds over Germany. On June 4 through November 9, 1961, the United States and Soviet Union faced off at Checkpoint Charlie, the famous border crossing in divided Berlin, with tanks positioned just 100 yards apart, gun barrels pointed directly at each other, fingers on triggers, waiting for someone to blink. The confrontation started because the Soviets wanted to control who could enter East Berlin, and when American diplomats were stopped and refused entry, the US sent tanks to make a point. The impact was that for 72 hours, the two superpowers, with enough nuclear weapons to end civilization, stared down each other's gun barrels on a German street, and the only reason we're alive today is because the Americans quietly proposed that the Soviets pull back one tank as a test, and when they did, the Americans did the same, and the crisis dissolved like a bad dream. The extra horror is that this almost happened over a border checkpoint dispute, not even a real war, just two superpowers playing chicken with the future of humanity, because neither wanted to look weak in front of the other. Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis was 13 days in October 1962 when humanity stood at the edge of the abyss and somehow didn't jump. The crisis began when the Soviet Union started installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, in response to America's failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and it peaked on October 27th when 3 separate major incidents occurred on the same day, including a Soviet submarine armed with nuclear torpedoes being hunted by the US Navy. This submarine, designated B-59, had lost contact with Moscow for days, was being bombarded with depth charges by American destroyers, and the crew had no idea if World War III had already started. The impact is bone-chilling because the submarine's captain and political officer wanted to launch their nuclear torpedo, but Soviet protocol required unanimous agreement from 3 officers, and the 3rd officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused, single-handedly preventing nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis is universally considered the closest the world has ever come to nuclear annihilation, and the fact that we survived it because one man on a submarine said no should terrify you about how fragile our existence really is. Yom Kippur War, DEFCON 3. Yom Kippur was the moment in October 1973 when the United States went on its highest peacetime nuclear alert because someone thought the Soviets were delivering nukes to Egypt. On October 24, 1973, as the Arab-Israeli war raged in the Sinai Desert despite a US-sponsored ceasefire, American intelligence erroneously reported that Soviet ships were transporting nuclear-armed Scud missiles to Egypt to defend against a potential Israeli nuclear strike. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, operating while President Richard Nixon was distracted by Watergate, ordered US forces to DEFCON 3, meaning the Air Force could mobilize in 15 minutes to deliver a nuclear strike anywhere on Earth. The impact was immediate and apocalyptic in potential, because Soviet leaders, seeing America's nuclear forces spinning up, had to decide whether this was preparation for a first strike against them, while Israel had already redeployed its own nuclear weapons in preparation for the worst. The crisis ended the next day when the Soviets assured Nixon no nuclear action was planned and pulled back their ships. But one Soviet vessel had already reached Egypt, and to this day, nobody knows what it was carrying or what happened to it. Stanislav Petrov incident. Stanislav Petrov incident was the night a 44-year-old Soviet officer chose to trust his gut instead of his computer screen and accidentally saved 8 billion lives. On September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was manning the Soviet early warning system when alarms screamed that 5 American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles were incoming, launched from bases in the United States and headed directly for Soviet territory. Soviet protocol was explicit. If the system detected a launch, Petrov was required to immediately report it up the chain of command, which would trigger a full-scale retaliatory nuclear strike before the American missiles could land, following the principle of launch on warning. The impact of this moment cannot be overstated because Petrov had less than 5 minutes to decide whether to report the attack, and if he reported it, Soviet leadership would have launched everything they had, turning the Cold War instantly hot and killing hundreds of millions within the hour. Petrov decided the alarm was a false positive because only 5 missiles were detected, and he reasoned that if America was really attacking, they would launch hundreds, not just 5, so he reported a system malfunction instead of an incoming strike. He was right. The satellite had mistaken sunlight, reflecting off clouds for missile launches, but Petrov was reprimanded and quietly reassigned because admitting the Soviet early warning system was catastrophically flawed would have been embarrassing. Able Archer 83. Able Archer 83 was a NATO military exercise in November 1983 that the Soviets genuinely believed was cover for an actual nuclear first strike. The exercise simulated the full escalation from conventional warfare to nuclear release, and for the first time ever, it included realistic nuclear command procedures, with heads of state participating, and actual encrypted communications that mimicked what a real nuclear war would look like. Soviet intelligence, already paranoid after President Ronald Reagan called them an evil empire and deployed Pershing II missiles to Europe, interpreted the exercise as preparation for a surprise attack and began preparing their own nuclear forces for immediate launch. The impact was that both sides were genuinely ready to launch, with Soviet aircraft loaded with nuclear weapons sitting on runways and American forces conducting what looked exactly like pre-strike positioning, creating a situation where one miscommunication could have triggered mutual annihilation. The crisis only ended when British intelligence informed the US that Soviet panic was real. NATO quietly scaled back the exercise, and both sides stepped away from the ledge without ever publicly acknowledging how close they came. The Able Archer incident happened just 2 months after Stanislav Petrov's false alarm, meaning 1983 nearly killed us twice in 8 weeks, which should make you wonder how humanity survived the Cold War at all. Norwegian rocket incident. Norwegian rocket incident was the moment in January 1995 when Russian President Boris Yeltsin opened his nuclear briefcase and had to decide whether to end the world over a weather rocket. On January 25, 1995, Norwegian and American scientists launched a Black Brant, the 12 research rocket, to study the northern lights, and although Norway had notified Russia about the launch a month earlier, the message never reached the right people in the Russian military. Russian radar detected the rocket, which followed the exact trajectory a US Navy Trident submarine launched nuclear missile would take to blind Russian radars before a first strike, and within minutes, Russian early warning systems were screaming that nuclear war had begun. The impact was that for the first time in history, the Russian nuclear briefcase, the Chejet, was activated and opened in front of President Yeltsin, giving him less than 10 minutes to decide whether to launch Russia's entire nuclear arsenal in retaliation. Yeltsin waited. Russian radar tracked the rocket's trajectory, and after 8 agonizing minutes, they realized it was heading out to sea, not toward Moscow, so the alert was cancelled. This incident is particularly horrifying because it happened in 1995, after the Cold War had supposedly ended, proving that even in peacetime, we're always one technical glitch or communication failure away from accidental nuclear apocalypse. Pristina airport standoff was the day in June 1999 when a British general refused a direct order to start World War III over an airport in Kosovo. On June 11, 1999, as NATO forces entered Kosovo after the bombing of Serbia, Russian peacekeepers suddenly seized Pristina airport before NATO could arrive, moving 200 troops and 30 armoured vehicles into position overnight. American NATO Commander General Wesley Clark was furious and ordered British General Mike Jackson to block the runways and use force to prevent Russian aircraft from landing, essentially demanding that British troops attack Russian forces. The impact was seismic because Jackson, commanding the ground forces, looked at Clark's order and replied with the now famous line, "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you," and refused to engage the Russians. Jackson understood that attacking Russian troops would force Moscow to respond militarily, potentially dragging NATO and Russia into direct combat, which could escalate to nuclear exchange faster than anyone could stop it. The standoff lasted for days, with NATO and Russian forces staring at each other across the runway, until diplomats negotiated a compromise that allowed Russian troops to remain at the airport under specific conditions, and once again, civilization survived because one person refused to follow orders. NORAD computer errors. NORAD computer errors were the back-to-back technical failures in 1979 and 1980 that convinced American military commanders that Soviet nuclear missiles were in the air when nothing was actually happening. On November 9, 1979, computers at the North American Aerospace Defense Command suddenly displayed a full-scale Soviet nuclear attack, with over 200 intercontinental ballistic missiles inbound, triggering immediate preparations for retaliation, including launching nuclear-armed aircraft and alerting missile crews. The alerts lasted 6 terrifying minutes before operators realized the system had accidentally loaded a training tape into the live warning system, meaning NORAD was responding to a simulation as if it were real. The impact should make your blood run cold because during those 6 minutes, bomber crews started their engines, missile silos went to launch-ready status, and the only reason we survived is that satellite systems showed no actual missile launches, giving commanders just enough doubt to pause before firing back. Then on June 3, 1980, it happened again, when a faulty computer chip worth 46 cents caused the system to randomly generate false warnings of incoming Soviet missiles. And this time, the error repeated multiple times over 3 days before technicians found the defective chip. These incidents reveal the darkest truth about the Cold War. We nearly ended human civilization multiple times, not because of human malice or strategic miscalculation, but because of technical glitches, budget computer parts, and training tapes loaded into the wrong slots by exhausted operators working overnight shifts.